React's useState hook is one of the most important and commonly used React hooks, and it of course is a super important hook, but as I'll show you in this video, it's actually not always the best way of managing stateful data. And I'm not talking about alternatives like Redux or the useReducer hook. Instead, in certain situations, there are even better alternatives which can offer substantial advantages for your users and your application performance. Now, of course, the useState hook is important. Most modern front-end web applications have some data which, when changed, should lead to an updated UI. And that's of course where in React applications useState comes into play. And for more complex situations, you could use useReducer, but either way, React checks whether the new JSX code, the new HTML code that is produced in the end, is different from the previous snapshot, and if it is, the changes are applied to the actual visible DOM, the actual visible page. And of course, as mentioned, that's a super important feature, and in many situations you therefore need useState. But in some situations you don't, and there might be better alternatives, as mentioned. Now, one example where you might not need useState is the submission of a form. Let's say you have some authentication form where you're gathering an email address and a password. One way of gathering and storing that information is to use state and some event handling functions that are connected to the input fields. With that, whenever the user presses a key on their keyboard, the updated input field value is stored in the state and synced back into the input field. And therefore, once the user is done, you can use those state values and you get the input entered by the user. That works, and there isn't necessarily anything wrong with that. But if you're not doing anything with those entered values whilst they're being entered, there actually is no reason to store them in state. Instead, you could use the useRef hook provided by React to create a ref to get access to the underlying input DOM elements and to then read from them when the form is submitted. That way, you make sure that the component is not constantly re-evaluated by React with every keystroke, but instead you only gather the input values when you need them. And then you could still validate them and update some state to show an error message if something's wrong with them, though it might also often be better to simply rely on the built-in validation functionality that's provided by the browser by setting the required attribute, for example, and using a proper input type. But that's one way of getting rid of some useState usage. You can use refs instead to get the values entered by the user. But you can do even better. You might not even need the useRef hook to read those input values. Instead, again, you can leverage the browser and features that are built into the browser. And for example, when a form is submitted, you can get that submitted form data simply from the event that's automatically generated by the browser. In the end, you can extract the entered input field values from that form data, and then you could, of course, again validate it and update some state if you wanted to, or use that built-in validation functionality I already mentioned. You can even reset the form with help of that event that's triggered automatically. And therefore, by using this approach, you're using features that are built into the browser, and you're not relying on React, and you're not unnecessarily re-evaluating the component over and over again, which of course can improve the performance of your application. By the way, I teach things like this and way more, starting at zero, but then diving deeply into React in my React the Complete Guide course. So you might want to check out this course if you want to learn all about React, including tricks and patterns and best practices like the ones shown in this video, but also other things like building full stack applications with Next.js, or how to implement routing or authentication, and many other crucial things. Below the video, you find a discount link to that course so that you can join it for a very very affordable price and learn all about React from the ground up, step by step and in great depth by building multiple beautiful, realistic example applications. Now, form submissions are just one example where you can potentially avoid using useState. Another situation where you can avoid using it are situations where you might be able to store information in the URL. Because yes, that is something we can do as web developers, even though it's often overlooked. But we can store data in the URL with help of query parameters. For example, when using React Router, you can easily extract and set those query parameters, and that can be very useful if you have, for example, situations like this, where you have a list that can be sorted. In this situation, we could of course use state to store the sorting order and update the UI whenever it changes, but alternatively, we could also store that information in the URL in a query parameter. By using React Router's useSearch params hook, for example, we can easily set that sorting order and update it in the URL whenever it changes, and it will automatically sync back and update our component when it changes. And then we can get the latest value with help of that same hook and update our UI accordingly. The advantage of this approach compared to using useState or useReducer and so on is that this information is now encoded in the URL. And this has the huge advantage that whenever the user reloads the page or shares a link to this page with another user, this sorting order is preserved. And this, therefore, can be a very useful pattern whenever you have situations where you might want to preserve some state and where you might want to make some state shareable. Because if you would be using useState, reloading the page or sharing a link to the page would lose that information, and that's not always the best user experience. Now, similar to this previous example, there also is another way of persisting state information. The URL is a great place to store certain pieces of information, especially if you want to have a shareable link, but sometimes local storage can be a decent alternative. So that if a user leaves your page and comes back, no matter which URL they visit, their state is restored. This can be super useful for things like dark mode. Again, if you would just be using useState, the information would be lost whenever the user reloads the page or leaves it and comes back in the future. If you also sync it to local storage, you make sure that it's persisted unless that storage is cleared. So therefore, if a user comes back, you can restore that stored state and make sure that the information is not lost. Here it's worth noting though that interacting with local storage alone won't trigger any UI updates, so you will technically still need useState, but it can still be a better way of using it. And therefore, you now saw a couple of different situations where you might be able to get rid of useState and therefore give your users a better user experience or better application performance, or where you might be able to use it in a better way. And that's therefore something you should keep in mind for the next React applications you might be working on.